So I find many of those results quite persuasive. I'm a little concerned about the dog study, because you're asking people to judge that as your canine atypical behaviors are all human behaviors.
That's right.
So essentially what one might expect is that the inversion effect that you're seeing in the rare canine behaviors is really just an anthropomorphizing effect.
Yeah, I see I think that's true. I mean, I think so, and you basically are able to co-opt what you do for yourself. You can co-opt on anything in the environment. It could be Legos and, yeah, okay.
So but your design didn't, so you pitted the familiarity explanation against yours, but your design didn't actually pit them against each other, because if the familiarity explanation was to be given a true chance, you'd need rare non-anthropomorphic behaviors for the canines, right? If you see a difference between the rare non-anthropomorphic and the familiar canine specific, then you're giving the competing hypothesis a fair shot at being right.
Hmm. On the other hand, I think that when we're sort of saying is it any animate object that gives you an inversion effect? Is it any kind of biological object that has a body? And so we actually chose the dogs as opposed to inanimate objects because we really wanted to see if there was something specific about the human body as opposed to just any animate object. We actually do have data with inanimate objects, and what we find is if you have a Lego thing that looks like a saguaro cactus, people will process it as a human doing this.
Right, no.
So the answer is we actually have data to show this, but I was just trying to explain why we did the other one, because we were actually trying to get at, is there something about animacy, or is there really something about being human that changes your processing?
Sure. I guess another way of thinking about it would be that you could have, if you're missing a cell.
You're right. Yeah, I agree with that. But
so that biases it towards your result rather than towards theirs, since you haven't given theirs an opportunity.
on the other hand, you don't see dogs in human postures very often. So if you're doing a purely visual expertise, how many times would you have seen something like this? It's still less. Yes.
I mean, is it Goofy versus Pluto? I always get mixed up which one's which, right? That Disney can have both an anthropomorphic dog and a non-anthropomorphic dog in the same cartoon, right? Well, as soon as it's anthropomorphic, it's no longer being processed as a dog.
Right. Well, that's sort of the point. So I guess the answer is I agree with your point, but it's like we were also trying to make a slightly different point. But it is true. It's like if as you degrade something that goes from human to animate sort of like human. I mean, we process Squidward as a human too, in SpongeBob, and the squid and the sponge have mechanical features that are like ours. So, I mean, the answer is we do have data that shows the other as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you go to the early slide with the house in the face? So, just another methodological question. In the original study, you showed only houses, or are there other in the park base?
Oh, we used only houses, but we've done it with cars, we've done it with shoes, we've done it with.
Because in this thing, again, there's a confound with whether it's a line drawing.
Right. No, we've done the same thing with photographs of cars. So they're the same kind of, so we've equated across the three different kinds of stimuli for photographic, whatever. In this study we didn't, but we have a whole set of studies where we have, it turns out that sort of it's what the object is that makes the difference as opposed to the actual presentation of the stimulus. Yes?
I'm just curious whether or not these configural effects have been looked at in other species.
Okay, so they've done some, there's been kinds of work with, other kinds of work with dogs and with birds. And what they've done, made up stimuli such as greebles. Greebles are these little men that they've created from bits and pieces of parts of things. And what they find is that dogs do not typically show inversion effects unless you're a dog expert. So if you are like a dog judge, you will show inversion effects for dogs, but not for other kinds of animals. Or if you're a birder, people who study birds, although they probably usually, I think birders mostly identify birds by their bird song, but
Maybe I can clarify
Actually,
your
I have a
question.
different,
Okay.
my question was somewhat different, which
Okay, then I missed
is,
it.
do dogs, looking at faces of dogs, show configural effects? So do other
Okay.
animals have these inversion effects?
right. So I believe that Chuck Nelson has done some work like that with primates.
Uh-huh.
And I believe that primates show similar, or some kind of expertise or facial processing
Mhm.
effects with other primates.
So in this study, you see the first image of the human, and then a blank, and then a different image. It kind of reminds me of those studies that have a geometric figure that where you see it before and you see it after, and you find differences between men and women. They show that.
So like Scott Johnson's work.
Yeah, they show that women are worse at spatial mental rotation.
Right.
Then how is this you would find the inversion effect in that as well.
Right, so the thing here is you're comparing two items that are always the same orientation. So we're not asking people to do mental rotation in this task. They're just sort of saying, is this image the same as that image? Or this posture the same as that posture? Unless you're both rotating them both all the way around.
can't
Now,
just-
Larry Parsons has done different kinds of work where they've actually manipulated the mental rotation. And what they find is, so they put a dot on the hand and the bodies are different orientations, and they ask people to say whether the dot is on the left hand or the right hand. And what they find is the position of the observer's hand is actually affecting sort of how long it takes them to rotate, because what they do is they sort of rotate the image to match their own bodies. Now, whether or not that has gender effects, they didn't look for that, but my guess is there probably are some.
Well, I mean.
I said, we don't find any gender effects here.
The point is not the gender effect, rather, if I were looking at this, I would think that any figure that's 3D, instead of a human being body, you would find the same inversion effect. And it's hard for me to say that there's something special about body inversion and processing it configurally like you would do with the face.
Well, the answer is, okay, so you're saying that any object that's upside down will be processed more slowly with less accuracy
Well,
than an
not
upright
any
object.
object. So for a shoe, it's pretty, it's very spherical in some sense. But if you
Okay,
take
well, I think the answer is that you don't expect there to be, all upside down objects, sort of regardless of how you sort of present them, tend to be slower and less accurate when they're upside down compared to right side up. The difference is that faces and bodies have a huge difference between the upside down orientation and the right side up orientation. They seem to be sort of, their canonical representation really has to do with the upright orientation. And when it's not upright, processing is changed in a lot of different ways. By a variety of different measures. And so the answer is all objects are harder upside down, but the big difference is only seen potentially in a social setting.
Is there a difference between autistic people and the inversion effect as opposed to people with gross physical disabilities?
That's a really interesting question. And currently, I have 4 people who are in wheelchairs. So the idea is they don't have postural support. But they all are in wheelchairs for a different reason. One person has a congenital neuromuscular disease. Another person is deafferented and can't walk. Another person had a gunshot wound to C9 and is paralyzed. And the other person was in a car accident and has a spinal cord injury. None of these people show a body inversion effect. But it's only 4 people. I want to get more people to see if that really seems to be. Well, the idea is that if you can't assume the positions, and if you really are using this simulation process of what you can do with your body, and if what you can do with your body doesn't match what you see other people doing, you might show
You
differences
talked
in
about-
processing.
You talked about training in autistic people, people that are trained to recognize faces. Would not the accident victims have a great deal of training behind them? Up to the
Yeah,
point that-
that was sort of a surprise finding. I was just having them do the body inversion effect while I was waiting for them to do something else. And so it's an interesting question that sort of has to do with body specificity of processing. But, you know,
So there's an immediate,
yeah, there seems to be something about sort of this immediate processing, and my guess is that if you gave them enough of them, they would learn how to do it. It's just that, you know, if you just sort of give them these things fast and dirty, they tend not to process it the same way as other people, you know?
So I maybe missed something, but I wonder how much you think the face processing or machinery is analogous, the same as the body processing one. So you seem
Right.
to emphasize a lot like the embodied nature of the body processing. I mean, I can imagine that the same is true for facial processing, but like we wouldn't have, I guess, the equivalent
Okay.
kind of really disfigured faces, people with really disfigured faces.
Well, I do have one thing that sort of has to do with that. I have some fMRI data, and the question is, do you use the same neural machinery or is it the same things? And so we looked at the inversion effect for faces and bodies in cars. And what you can see is the sort of, there's a difference in terms of the extent, but in the majority of our, well, over half of our subjects so far show activation in the exact same spot of the fusiform, the right fusiform gyrus for the inversion effect for faces and for bodies.
Do you think
Which
there's
suggests that there's some component of stimuli. When you look at whole head analysis, what you see is there seems to be a social processing network. You seem to have, there's a fusiform face area, an extrastriate body area, the fusiform gyrus, superior temporal sulcus, and you sort of have some inferior frontal gyrus. You sort of create this, there's a social neural network in the brain. And what we seem to be finding, at least for faces and bodies, is both of these stimuli sort of activate the whole network, but what happens is they activate it to different extents. And so you get low activation sort of in the body processing regions when you see faces, and the face regions like fusiform gyrus seem to be really, you know, more extensive, more active. When you see bodies, you find the face processing areas are active, but to a lesser extent, the body processing areas are more active. So we sort of see, sort of like, depending on sort of what kind of social stimulus they're processing, we sort of see a give and take among different regions concurrently.
just a follow-up? So do you think the kind of experiential nature of the processing is different? So the fact that we're using our body, is the body processing more embodied than the facial processing, I guess?
I think they're, to the extent you use your own face to recognize someone else's face, there's some work. I'm spacing on Carl's last name. Anyway, but some of the EMG studies suggest that you're doing some kind, you're doing this sort of, your face is responding to what other people are doing. It's sort of harder to do EMG on larger muscles because it actually, you have a lot of inertia in the muscles, and we've actually tried this. We were actually looking to see if you showed facial expressions for fear, would you find similar kinds of muscular responses in the body? In other words, would it leak from the face to the body? And to some extent, what we're seeing is if you show somebody's like body showing a fear effect, you'll get frontalis effects in the face. But it's harder to show the opposite because the EMG is low. But I think the answer is that there seem to be, there is this mimicry process that's happening for bodies and for faces. And I'm not saying that that's the only way to process information. I think we have lots of different routes for processing information, and one is used sort of preferentially, and then we can find other routes or other ways of getting to the process, or getting to an answer that works. And I think, the question is just, is this sort of the default function for the embodied route? And I think the answer is for faces and bodies. That seems to be the default for typically developing people. As far as our data seem to show so far. Yeah.
Can you go to that slide where you had data showing people copying the body postures I wanted to just, because you were talking about how it facilitates, how you didn't get a facilitatory effect when people copied body postures, but in the percent errors shown in your graph, did it actually seem that it hurt their processing? That people did actually better? I just don't remember. Are they doing?
Yeah.
Is it
The
not
story's a-
only not facilitatory, it's actually inhibitory somehow? And if it's inhibitory, wouldn't that actually argue against embodied cognition?
Well, the answer here is that there's something going on when you're matching. Now, one of the things that we do show, this is sort of a more complicated story that I didn't want to get into during the talk, but it turns out that the timing of the task makes a difference. Because in that first experiment, when I showed you that you moved your arms, you looked at someone else, you were better. If you actually shorten the amount of time that people have to process, or the SOA, the time between the stimuli, you can flip the direction of that interaction. You get the same kind of interaction, but in the opposite direction. And the way we think about it is you have competing inputs for the same body representation coming in from different modalities. And they have to, it takes them a while to sort of resolve and figure out how they interact with each other. And so we can actually show, we can vary the SOA and actually show that we still get an interaction between part moved and part seen. It's just that the actual timing of the task changes the interaction, the direction of the interaction. So the idea is that visual inputs and proprioceptive inputs are combining. It's just that how they combine depends on some of the timing constraints of the task and the aspects of the task. This particular task is set up so the timing would show interference actually, which was something we didn't, this is actually how we found out about the other thing. As we started getting interference here, we started thinking, what's different about this one compared to the other one? And then we realized that we were setting us up, once we did the other experiment, we realized that we sort of set ourselves up for inhibition rather than facilitation.
Would you see the same in facial mimicry?
Facial mimicry is very fast.
Yeah, well.
So it's within like the first couple of 100 milliseconds.
That's
results.
true, but it's automatic facial mimicry. What if you gave them instructions as you did here? Would you predict that these SOA changes would affect facial mimicry as well? Because we always see facial
Yeah,
facilitation.
Yeah. So the answer is, if our theory is right, we should see it, although it may happen on a different time scale because the muscles are smaller and can change more quickly. So that's a good question. The answer is we should be able to find that if we manipulated it in the right time scale. Yeah.
So I'm curious as to how much one can sort of push the boundaries of the phenomenon. And your argument is we're using our bodies to understand the actions of other bodies. You made reference to sort of in rather broad terms about evolutionary pressures and the adaptive problems that the organism needs to face. It seems to me that interacting with conspecifics in general is one thing, but that in any sexually reproducing species, differentiating between the sexes is important. Carrie, who's here somewhere, there she is. So she has, these lots of quite compelling results using point light representations that
Yes.
people are very good at differentiating male from female. And obviously, the basic body design is the same, but there are parts that are different, right?
Yes.
So one wonders whether, you can, this embodied matching, as it were, is only going to work when you're talking about, say, limb movements and things like that that are not sexually dimorphic. But it's not going to help you. You won't get inversion effects, for example, when you're looking at parts of the body that are substantially different. Because you can't map them onto your own. You don't have the same parts.
Right.
I'm using very general terms, right?
Well, I guess I think of them as slightly different. I don't think of our breasts as really performing functions per se. Like your breasts don't act on the environment typically. You think of ways that might work. I don't want to go there. But the idea is if we want to change the environment, we want to perform an action that's going to fundamentally change the environment, you need an effector. So you need your hands, you need your feet, you need your mouth, you need, potentially your head to change something. So then the limbs perform a very different kind of function maybe than just distinguishing.
I don't know. It seems to
gender.
me that, for example, if one of your principal goals is understanding others' intentions, right, and that's the way you set it up, being able to detect sexual arousal, for example, that should tell you an awful lot about others' current goal trajectory or something
Oh, that's a good point.
like that.
Well, I do know that, like Maggie Schiffar's done this work with point light walkers, and she knows that when you have people thinking, you have the point light walker going like this towards you, there's a very different kind of response than if you see a point light walker walking away from you and things like that. And my guess is if you had done, if she had a skin conductance test, she could have shown that differed. And I believe for point light walkers, actually I don't know whether they were male or female. Did she vary them? Do you remember,
I
Karen?
don't know in that study. I would think so, but I don't remember.
I think she usually does half and half. So I'm not sure that she actually looked at difference, looking at gender matches between viewer and,
Sure, but that could
would be an interesting.
That could be analogous to your fear responses to an angry face,
Yeah,
right? So
yeah.
we might expect, for example, that the fairly phylogenetically old systems to respond differently than male aggression and female aggression because males are going to pose a more substantial threat. That could be a separate system.
Well, that's sort of interesting. I hadn't really thought of it that way. I mean, we were really thinking about, the idea of performing actions on the environment, and sort of changing something, getting things you need to eat, and pushing people, sort of things where you're actually physically interacting with the environment. I hadn't really thought about that. That's actually something that's curious. And our neighbor, we should talk about this, Carrie.
Sounds good.
Yeah. See, I come from a haptic background. Actually, I studied haptic perception and action, and so sort of a lot of embodied processing, literally where you're feeling and touching and working and changing, moving things around and understanding what you're feeling. And so, so all of my approaches are really about how you affect change in the world, but I hadn't really thought of that. But that would be a natural extension of that.
I mean, it's possible that they're separate systems, right? But,
Yeah, and sort of the way I think about things is we sort of have some general mechanism systems that sort of work, and sort of as you need them for the environment, they're flexible systems that sort of bring in things that need to be brought in and co-opted to perform the function that you need at the time that you need them. And so you could probably show that these systems are separate, but then you can also probably show that they can get co-opted in the right task situation where you need them. That would be my prediction. Yeah.
I was wondering about I imagine not much is known about this, but the phylogeny of this, so where in evolutionary history it appears and how it's distributed across species. And I was wondering if some of this kind of system of representing motor movements using mechanisms that are designed to control your own motor movements might have something to do with, or might appear in species that do things like fine-grained motor manipulation, or that move their limbs in particular ways
Right, well, we know
to
that
achieve action. So
Siamese
primates
spider
in
fish,
particular.
right? Fish do this. So like, Siamese fighting fish.
They do like mirroring
they have-
each other's.
Well, they have the erection
Right.
of the gills, or I'm not quite sure what you call that. It's not piloerections, or not
Sure.
pilos, but what
Yeah.
I'm saying is, but fish posture to demonstrate aggression. So they don't really have limbs, but they have some things that
True.
are demonstrations and,
Right, no, I mean, I can, but on the other hand, so
and things like.
you said that there's multiple systems, and I would imagine, for example, a monkey seeing an eagle swooping to attack
Mhm.
can understand what the eagle is doing
Right,
without
because it has a.
being able to, without needing to mimic
Right.
the eagle's behavior because it's
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
I mean,
So there might be some, hardwired systems.
interpretation systems
Yeah,
that
and
don't use your own
so
body.
even in the, actually I have two kind of things to say. So,
Okay.
so like, even for vocal responses, like the vervet monkeys, my guess is that they don't sort of learn the different calls between snake and eagle and, what's another one?
Leopard.
Leopards, yes. So, they're like those different kinds of things that are probably biologically ingrained, that there's something there which, they've sort of been part of their vocal structure that leads them to, so that everybody knows that these things are bad guys to get away from.
Right.
So to some extent, there's probably some mechanisms like that, and then there are probably some learning things there too. Somebody asked about, do other species recognize?
Joe.
I just remembered, there was a study by Kendall who looked at sheep, and they stuck electrodes in the sheep's superior temporal sulcus. And what they found was that sheep could actually distinguish between quadrupeds and bipeds And, you know, at the single cell level, they could actually, you know, that they distinguished between things that were sort of like Lacan-specific types and things that were more like humans. And so they actually had different kinds of selective mechanisms for different kinds of animals.
Well,
Or
it
that
makes
were tuned
sense, right,
for
that
things that were
animals would
relevant to them.
Be able to classify, categorize
Right.
other kinds
Sure.
of animals in the animal.
But
So it's
I
not
mean, I
just
guess what I'm getting at is the specific advantage that you get from mapping your own body parts into another person's
Right.
body parts, rather than just, because you can imagine just a system that uses a kind of perceptual template, that, where you don't need to do a mapping of any
Right.
kind, right? And
Mhm.
it seems like this mapping gives you some kind of advantage. I mean, people have suggested that an imitation and things like that,
Right.
but I'm also thinking about, you know, some of the results that,
The
I mean,
question
it's
is
a
sort of
weird
how
connection,
domain
but-
general
but-
versus how domain specific, is that
Well, what is
sort of-
the, I mean, what is this, the sort of extra benefit that you might get from
Right.
having this body-to-body mapping,
Yeah,
as opposed to just using more brute force visual perception, right? Because, I mean, there's a
Right.
special pathway that seems to somehow.
sure,
be
so in
advantage.
terms of emotional processing, like Pessoa has talked about the high and the low road of emotional processing. So there's sort of this, the low road is sort of the subcortical route for processing things like fight or flight, and you know, like, where you don't really need to know what it is, you just need to know that it's coming fast and hard, you wanna get out of there kind of system, right? You
Yep.
just need to get a valence of, you know, bad and you wanna
Right.
leave, you know, so maybe that there are some of these, you know, built-in sort of mechanisms for just that basic kind of response.
Well, I'm
And
thinking that-
as you were suggesting, there might be some benefits for being able to do conspecifics, because you need to associate, you know, sexual advances that are positive versus sexual advances that are negative, or, you know, things like that kind of processing. So you can see how the body mapping kind of thing would be helpful in helping you to disambiguate whether someone is being aggressive or not aggressive, or, you know, and what the right context could be. You can see how that might be helpful for the mapping there.
But, I mean, so one kind of result I'm thinking of, which is a little bit far
So
field,
like a
but
finer
people
grained
have
analysis,
suggested
I guess.
that it might be related, is a mirror self-recognition.
Uh-huh.
So, you know, there's species, you put the dot
Right,
on the
right,
forehead,
the
and
rouge
that's
test.
animal, and then you see if they recognize that it's themselves when they
Uh-huh.
see themselves in the mirror. And some people suggested that, I mean, there's species differences in that.
That's right.
And some people suggested that it results from an ability to map the
That's right.
the
other
motor
person-
stuff that's going on in the mirror to your own limbs, and you go, oh, hey, I moved my arm, that thing moves its arm, it must be me,
Right.
right? And the animals that you don't see that in are animals that don't generally, I mean, one hypothesis is that they're animals that don't look at their own limbs when
Mhm.
they're acting, right? So like a horse or something like that doesn't really need to see where its feet are in order to do what it does in the world, right?
Right.
And primates are, you know, have this interesting thing where we manipulate things with our hands.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it just
So
seems to me
we-
like there might be an interesting connection there where this
Sure.
awareness of limbs might have something to do with.
Well, Maggie Schiffer has done a study that sort of addresses this. So
Yeah.
what she did was she had point-light display, and she had people come in with their friends, and they point-light displays, they had them dancing and doing different, you know, playing ping pong, or they had them doing all the different kinds of actions. And then what she did was she brought them back later after she took the movies, and she looked to see whether or not, you know, sort of like how well they could discriminate sort of who the people were. And what they found was they were better at recognizing their own body movements on point-light displays than others, but they were still better with their friends than they were than strangers. So then, you know, so she thought this had to do with motor expertise, sort of like, you know, visual motor expertise, sort of combination of the two. But then she's, you know, people argued that, well, you just see yourself move. So she did this sort of ingenious thing where she put a camera on people's heads and point-light, you know, and she basically took point-light displays of them walking around, the things that you would see as you did stuff, and then showed these point-light movies to people, and they had no idea what they were looking at. Like, that kind of motion, even though you see it all the time, meant nothing.
Right,
There was
right.
no organization, you know, basically no organizational structure to that, which sort of suggested it's something different from just being able to see what you're going to do. But that being said, we have specialized attentional systems that integrate like touch and vision in peripersonal space. And so we have these bimodal neurons in inferior parietal cortex, among others, which respond to stimuli that are tactile stimuli and stimuli that are near the hand and near the mouth. And so and they're hand-centered. So the idea is that if you move your hand to here, it doesn't matter where they are in space, as long as the stimulus is in relation to the hand, they'll fire. But if you keep them in the same visual, same physical location, you move the hand, they stop firing. Because what they're doing is they're presumably helping us coordinate our vision with our hand in spaces where we perform, stereo, we have stereo, depth perception and binocular depth perception, and things where we can do very small, fine detail. And these things, and you can actually get these sort of bimodal neurons to fire if you give people a tool, and then you extend the tool and you can get outside of personal space. It has to do with sort of the functional interaction. So we do have systems that seem to code specifically for the kinds of things that we do in here. I'm just not sure how those systems actually relate to the body processing systems. The action systems seem to be maybe operating at sort of a different organizational level than just like attention or localization. Yeah.
On a different part of phylogeny, I've always been incredibly impressed by schooling fish and flying flocks of birds that they can just pinpoint turn at the same exact millisecond.
Right.
Is anybody looked at mirror neurons or systems like this to try to figure out how they can do that? It's such a quick thing and involves, all this kind of stuff that you're talking about in a fish brain.
Greg, do you know anything about that? It's a really interesting question, and I have to say the evolutionary side of things is something I'm developing. And actually, since I knew you were in an evolutionary group, I tried to put something in that would have some kind of evolutionary argument that would sort of work along the way to the, greater or lesser success, right? But anyway, that's a really, this idea of coordination and how, the timing of when we know what to do. So like in a waltz, you have to know when to give, when to push, the timing of things. And you can do it even without music, and so many of our social behaviors are these finely, precisely timed things where it looks like the way people, or I guess like Meg Wilson and Gunther Noblick would argue that sort of what you're doing is you're doing a mental simulation of what other people are doing. And the idea is that you figure out when you should move based on your predictions of what they're doing and when they should be doing something. And so you actually have this mental simulation that helps you time your actions relative to someone else. So this has to do with vocal turn taking and a variety of other kinds of, piano playing. I think they did it with jazz playing. Some people looked at jazz playing knowing when to come in. I don't know how that relates to birds, but it suggests that my guess is that maybe there's something with birds that know when to, or those could be separate cues, if there's some kind of cue that in the environment that just says chirp.
I think it's been proposed that each bird just kind of pays attention to one other bird.
Okay, so that would make
Heuristic.
sense, right?
And
It's
that
very simple. Ian
emerges.
Cousins says he's very nice.
Yeah.
It takes hardly any information at all to do those
Yeah.
things. It's just need to keep track of the position and velocity of a couple of neighbors and the whole thing.
Oh, I need to know that stuff. That sounds really interesting.
He's at Princeton in biology. Ian
What's his
Cousins.
name? Ian Cousins. Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah.
One of the key ideas of Barsalou and Neidenthal and so forth, idea of embodiment is this idea of sort of covert simulation,
That's right.
which doesn't quite reach the level of action or illusions or whatever. But it seems to me that if you're simulating an action to understand an action, then the kinds of experiments which you've done, which shows potentiation under some circumstances instead of interference, it seems to me that simulation theory strongly predicts that if you're trying to do something with your limbs, it'll be much harder to understand what somebody else is doing with their limbs. Or in the examples that you just mentioned of complementarity, where you have to move in the opposite direction, or you have to do something that's complementary to what somebody else is doing instead of moving in synchrony. It seems to me that those are very difficult to explain that way. Why should, if I'm trying to understand, what somebody else's posture is, and I'm doing other things with my arms, how can I be simulating what the other person is doing if I'm doing something completely different? That should grossly interfere with understanding what they're doing.
Right. And, I don't think that's a really well thought out part of the theory. I agree with that. And, the work that we have that has some suggestion to that is you sort of have an initial, this idea that you have these differing inputs that are sort of conflicting with your ability to sort of do different kinds of things. And, you know, it may take a while to figure out how to get it from interference to facilitation so that you can kind of match sort of what's going on with you and someone else. It's called the common code theory, which Wolfgang Prince has suggested. But what he almost always says that when you're seeing something, you're doing something, you get interference because you're trying to access the same representation. And some of our work suggests that if you give it time, it figures out a resolution to the conflict, and then you can find facilitation. Now, how that works in the emotional simulation theory, they don't really have a good explanation for that. And I think the idea is you do the simulation process very quickly, so you sort of, I think the only way that they can do that is you simulate what they're going to do so that you can then simulate your thing as a result. And it just happens very quickly. But I think that's a weakness in the theory. I mean, I've been trying to, that's something that we were sort of trying to figure out ourselves. We don't have a good answer based on what they've developed so far.
I have a proposal for a subgroup for you to look at are people that are very good at impersonating others. Because you've got the deficit group that might be interesting to see how these systems work.
Or even looking at people who score high on empathy. You know, you can do some kind of individual differences. So people who are high on empathy. We have looked at people who are like dancers or synchronized swimmers, or martial arts people who are used to matching what they're doing to someone else. And we don't find strong, we don't find any effects of that kind of basic level of expertise. Now, some people at University of London, Calvo and Marino, they looked at neural activation for people viewing, they've looked at ballet dancers, capoeira dancers, that Brazilian, sort of like martial arts dance. I'm probably saying it wrong, but, and then people who were not dancers. And what they did was they showed them videotapes of ballet movements and capoeira movements. And what they found was, for those actions that you're an expert in, you know, people tended to activate one kind of network. And they activated some of it and some other things when they showed the ones that they weren't expert in, and the novices showed a completely different kind of thing. So that suggested that there is an effective expertise in sort of, at least at a neural level, in terms of what people are viewing and how they're sort of categorizing the actions that they see. And so at some level, it seems like that's making a difference. But I don't know if, you know, the interest, I was actually talking with
Is there a gender effect in dance?
Pardon me?
Is there a gender effect in dance? The corollary being white men lead.
You know, they looked at a gender effect, but I actually, the problem with their study was that they looked at female and male dancers, at whether or not, so they had pictures of female dancers and male dancers doing the same things in ballet, with the idea that if your body matches the female, you know, so female bodies have different center of gravity, and would they be better for males versus females? And they only looked at it one way. They looked at females judging male and females, and they found that they were better and had different neural activations for female dancers than male dancers. But they didn't do the other one around. Like, they didn't look at male dancers to see if the vice versa. So, but at least they showed some evidence. At least there was something about the actual
I had a
physical.
girlfriend once who had studied ballet, and her opinion was simply men exist only as a foundation for the women.
It might be a bit of justification for what they did.
And looking at it another way, the professional musicians will always hand the melody to the worst player because it's the easiest.
Yeah.
So is there something inherently different in the way that the genders are wired?
I don't have an answer to that.
On that note, we are pretty much at the end of our time
Yes.
slot, so